I want to go over with you the concept of source hypothesis, also known as documentary hypothesis. This is a scholarly theory that was postulated by liberal theologians, liberal scholars, 150 years or so ago regarding the Old Testament, regarding how the Old Testament was actually formed. You'll see in your book on page 20 and following the information on the source hypothesis, what the book calls the source hypothesis. And it has the letters J, E, D, and P. We'll go over those here in just a moment or so. But what I want to do is give you kind of a background regarding this theory, also regarding where it came from and why so many scholars have held to it, even though it has been proven through archaeology not to be accurate. It doesn't really hold water if you spend any time studying the actual archaeology of the Old Testament. And I'm sure that for you as a student of Old Testament history and a survey of the Old Testament, this is probably going to introduce some concepts you're not familiar with, but it will help you to better understand why so many schools teach that Moses did not write the first 5 books of the Pentateuch, and why so many schools teach that much of the Old Testament was written far later than what it was written, actually written, and what they're discovering that it was written. And so I just want to go over this with you today. So we're going to take a look here at source hypothesis. As we move through the slides, the first slide I want to go over is the description of the 4 documents, or what are called the 4 documents of the documentary hypothesis. In actuality, this is not even accurate for those who postulate the source hypothesis. There are at least 6, possibly even 7 documents that they supposedly find within the Old Testament. Remember that this really came out of literary forms. The Old Testament is written in a number of different literary forms, and so because they were written in different forms, or they used the name of a particular God, or for Yahweh they may have used Jehovah or Elohim or some other Hebrew name for God, then it was postulated that perhaps a different author wrote it. Well, according to the documentary hypothesis or source hypothesis, the J documents were actually written about 850 BC, or 850 years before Christ, or if you do the more modern dating system, BCE, before Common Era. And it was by an unknown writer or author or authors in the southern kingdom of Judah. This author was especially interested in personal biographical sketches that were characterized by vivid delineation of character. In other words, he was writing very descriptive works about God or about the individuals. He will often portray or refer to God in anthropomorphic terms, as though God himself possesses body parts. And you'll see that in different parts of the Old Testament. The Psalms talks about the wing of God, being under the wing of the Almighty, the presence of God, the arm of God, that sort of thing. And so it also shows or talks about the passions of God. God was angry. God is a jealous God. And so because they use anthropomorphic terms that are typically considered human, those who first postulated the documentary hypothesis decided that this must be an author who wanted to, in some symbolic form, represent God in a more real way to people. And so consequently, the J documents were quote, and I'll put that in quotes, discovered. Moving further through our slideshow, we see the E document, which was written about 100 years or so later. So we have the J document, 850 BC, and we have the E document about 750 BC by someone from the northern kingdom of Israel. Now, What that means is Israel has been split. You have the 10 northern tribes that were ruled by different kings, and then the 2 southern tribes that were ruled by different kings after Solomon's day. After Solomon passed off the scene, the kingdom was divided into 2 different kingdoms. And so that's why you have this belief that the J documents were written by someone from Judah, which was the southern 2 tribes that were headquartered in Jerusalem, and then you have the northern 10 tribes, and eventually both of these are carried away into captivity by the Syrians and the Babylonians. But the E document was written about 750 BC or BCE by an unknown writer in the northern kingdom, supposedly more objective than J in his narrative style, less consciously tinged with ethical or theological reflections, so you don't see as much theology in these documents, supposedly. The writer tended to dwell upon concrete particulars, such as the rituals that were used in the temple or the rituals that were used in the synagogues, the origins of names or customs of particular importance to the Israelite culture. So, types of prayers, liturgies, worship style, things like that. So, this is the E document that we see. In Genesis, carrying this discussion further with E, in Genesis, E shows an interest in ritual worship and will represent God as communicating through dreams and visions rather than through direct anthropomorphic contact after the fashion of J. So, for instance, the J document would say something to the effect that God spoke to Moses through a bush that was burning but was not consumed. So there's a direct vocal contact with Moses, whereas in the E documents, God speaking to prophets through dreams or visions, such as the way he did with Ezekiel or Daniel later on in the Old Testament. In Exodus through Numbers, E will exalt Moses as a unique miracle worker with whom God could communicate in anthropomorphic guise. And so here we see even though there is a delineation, there's a separation of J and E, we see there's a crossover as well where E will use Moses in some of the writings. And remember, this is all theory. I'm not using these terms, the J document, the E document, to tell you that there are actually documents that are marked like this, Judean, Yahwehistic, or Jehovah documents versus Elohim documents, which would be the E. I'm not telling you that that's the actual case. I'm telling you this is the theory, and I'm just teaching you so you understand this. And then we're going to kind of go into some other contrary views about it. And then sometime around 650, 100 years later, a redactor, an editor, came along and combined J and E into a single document known in scholarly circles as J/E. So you see now you have to back up in time to 850 BC, where you have the J documents originally, oral tradition, then the J documents are written down late, very late, then the E documents are written down even later, and now, even 100 years later, they're combined together. Now we go to the D document, composed possibly under the direction of the high priest Hilkiah as an official program for the Reformation that King Josiah is sponsoring sometime around 622 BC or BCE. Its object was to compel all the subjects of the kingdom of Judah to tear down their totems, their high places, their places of Baal worship, their local sanctuaries, which in the Old Testament are called high places, and bring all of their sacrifices, bring all of their religious contributions, all of their worship to the Temple of Jerusalem. Now, here's the issue with this description that I have. And if you study the reform of Josiah, his issue was not that they weren't worshiping in Jerusalem. His issue is that they were worshiping other gods other than Yahweh, other than Jehovah. Yahweh and Jehovah are synonymous terms used at different times in history, but they're the same name. They mean the same thing. So if we use them interchangeably here, just know that that's the difference. It's just a different name, but the same person that we're speaking of in the Old Testament, the God of the Old Testament. And so here in the D documents, Deuteronomic documents, we see that basically what they're saying is that they want to bring the worship under a more strict guideline, more strict law, which Deuteronomy actually is the law. It's where we see the law. And so those who theorized this wanted to provide some separate understanding of why there seems to be a difference in the way the people were worshiping at one point, and now they're commanded to worship differently. Well, the truth is they had left off worship and worshiping Jehovah or worshiping Yahweh, and Josiah, as a young king, said, "We need to go back and begin uh, worshiping Jehovah once again." So that's really what the D documents, according to these liberal scholars, teach, is that there was apparently a difference in the liturgy and worship in the way they did things. All right, so let's go then further. It says that this document was strongly under the influence of the prophetic movement, particularly by Jeremiah and Jeremiah's contemporaries. A few years later, Ezekiel. Isaiah had come a little before him. But anyhow, these were members of a Deuteronomic school who later reworked, according to this theory, they reworked the historical accounts that are recorded in Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. So basically, what this theory states is that they rewrote the history books of Israel. Now, this is all based around the idea that Israel didn't have a written language. They did not have people educated and capable of actually writing. We see now that not only did Israel have a written language in archaeology that dates back well before these times, 1200, 1400, 1500 BC, so many, many years before this time in history. But those who postulate, or those who bring out these theories, are bringing them out because they do not accept that Israel could have had a written language, or would have had a written language, or even had formalized training in schools for their young. And so now we see that they have to rewrite the history of Israel in order to make it fit within the narrative of the documentary hypothesis, or within the Deuteronomic school of thinking when it comes to religious worship, when it comes to the worship of Jehovah or Yahweh. And so we see these unknown editors now coming on the scene here. They're re-editing the history of Israel. And then finally, the P documents, or the priestly documents, were supposedly composed in various stages, all the way from the time of Ezekiel, and here's one of those extra documents that they found. They call it the Holiness Code H, which they say is Leviticus 17 through 26. This would be sometime around, that's what CA, circa, sometime around 570 BC or BCE. So we see again a much later time frame for this. It was brought back to Jerusalem in the post-exilic era by Ezra. So what they're saying is that while the children of Israel were in captivity, under the Babylonian captivity, the southern tribe of Judah, Ezekiel, as he prophesied to those tribes that were held captive, as Ezekiel wrote his works, he creates this holiness code that is now added back in, or redacted into, edited into the Levitical code that is given to us there in the Old Testament, and that's Leviticus 17 through 26. And that was brought back then to Jerusalem during the time of Ezra, when the Jews come back out of captivity. After the 70 years of captivity that they were held in Babylon, they come back into Israel, they come back to Jerusalem, they reestablish worship, they reestablish temple worship, the worship of Jehovah, and this gives them the guidelines for that worship. And he is the one who supposedly, Ezra is the one who supposedly brought in the priestly sections that were added to the Torah, or the writings of the Old Testament. P then is concerned with a systematic account of the origins and the institutions of the Israelite theocracy, and it shows particular interest in origins in genealogical lists. So all of those lists where you see the different fathers and their children listed, This is supposedly the time when all of that became of great importance to them, not that it was of great importance to the prior kings or to the prior rulers in Israel. And it also provides details of sacrifice and ritual. Now, I want you to understand that this is given or provided to us through scholarly research or through scholarly understanding. Now, when I say scholarly, that's you've got to be careful and know that this is not necessarily a thoroughly researched theory as much as it is someone's concept or idea because they saw variations within the literature of the Old Testament and they saw differences and they thought, well, the same person probably didn't write this. It looks too different. It never asked the question, is it possible that at a different era or a different time or under different circumstances could a person write something that would be a bit different or in a way that would actually be somewhat different than what they have written earlier? And the answer, of course, to that is yes, they do. And we see that with authors all the time, particularly in scholarly research. And we see that in authors who change their opinions. Textbooks are written, and then the same author will come back 10 years later and edit that textbook and add in additional information that he has at that time, and it's written somewhat differently. So it's really someone's theory that was used to discredit the works that had been attributed to Moses. Those who came up with the theory did not accept the possibility, and this is important, you have to understand this. There were two competing views about 150, 200 years ago when this theory was first postulated. Those who came up with the theory did not accept the possibility of divine inspiration, that God would transcend between time and space, come and speak to someone like Moses or other humans and give them his words, and then they would be pinned down. So they didn't accept the possibility of divine inspiration, or that man could have written, or that one man could have written all of these books, the first 5 books of the Pentateuch. They talk about the education level, they talk about the understanding, they talk about the written language, all of these things, which have historically and archaeologically been disproven. These are all theories. They didn't understand, didn't know, didn't have the archaeological data at the time. And then when they looked at the Hebrew, they saw different patterns within language, thought, well, this had to have been written by a different person. And so it's important that you understand these are theories that were postulated because there were a group of scholars, theologians, who did not accept or believe in the possibility of divine inspiration, and thus these theories came to be. Now, there are no other competing theories other than the conservative view, the more conservative idea that God did inspire these men to write, and God did inspire these men, and they wrote his words as he was speaking through them, and that they penned exactly what God had said. Now, that is a competing view, but it is not widely accepted, and it's not widely accepted because of the belief aspect of it. Well, there's as much belief in this other theory as there is in the idea that God spoke to man. So just know that this is a theory that someone has used to discredit the possibility that Moses actually wrote the first 5 books, and that much of the Old Testament was written far earlier than what has originally been postulated, because the children of Israel did have a written language, because the children of Israel, the Israelites, did have schools that taught their children how to read and how to write. All right. So in summary, J and E will use different names for God. So because they use different names for God primarily throughout their works, they have to have been written by someone other than the same person that different ones wrote. P was written by priests or those affiliated with priests in the priestly order of the temple. So these documents must have been written after the time of Solomon, who built the first temple. It couldn't have been written during the time of the tabernacle. Couldn't have been written during the time of the wandering. And so because the priestly order had not been established. Well, that's not exactly true. The priestly order is very clearly established early on in the Old Testament, and we see that in the writings, but because the temple had not been established until after Solomon, the assumption then is made that these priestly documents could not have been written prior to that. And then D was written at the time of King Josiah's reforms and demanded that all sacrifice be brought to the temple. They were to abandon the high places of worship. And this is based around the assumption of financial gain for the king, financial gain for Jerusalem, and those types of things. So that's a summary of what the documentary hypothesis was. Now let me give you a little history of it. The theory was developed in 1876, or really synthesized. It had actually been growing. There was an era, a time prior to this, in which several European scholars, primarily language scholars, began to look at these different languages, and when they saw these variations, they began to postulate or speculate that perhaps different authors had written these books. And Julius Wellhausen was really the person who synthesized this all together in one format, which we see today as the documentary hypothesis. And it used an evolutionary model to show the development of the Pentateuch in the Old Testament. This is even true. Scholars have said that religion, this idea of men being connected to something other than themselves, tying them back to something far distant in their past, their faith, whatever. Religion was actually polytheistic originally and evolved to monotheism, which is what we see in the Old Testament. Well, we now know historically as well as archaeologically that is incorrect. But that was a theory. That was postulated as a theory. Many people bought into it. Many people glommed onto that theory. And rather than challenging the idea that it's more likely that religion was bound in monotheism and became polytheistic later on, they reversed that. And so we see today through archaeology that that's not correct. But it uses this theory developed by Julius Wellhausen, or really synthesized by Julius Wellhausen, really did use an evolutionary model, and that was in vogue in that day. Charles Darwin's evolution, the natural selection, the whole idea of the species, simple species evolving into more complex species. He took that theory, and that theory was moved across all different disciplines. And we see this in literary criticism, we see it in higher criticism, and we see it in this source hypothesis or documentary hypothesis as well. It was a theory of development from primitive animism or polytheism to sophisticated monotheism. The 20th century has witnessed a vigorous reaction against Wellhausen and the documentary hypothesis, and general confidence in it has been somewhat undermined. The truth is, it has been completely undermined, even in liberal circles, and it is no longer accepted as a legitimate historical group of facts or a body of data or body of information, and they are looking for viable alternatives. The problem is that there is none out there other than that a monotheistic religious faith was very early in man's history, at the earliest point in man's history on the earth, and that he was actually writing and recording about this monotheistic encounter, this encounter with God, and that Moses himself had an encounter with this God and wrote that down. And so Julius Wellhausen's theory has been undermined. The problem is that there's not been a viable alternative other than the more conservative view of what has traditionally been taught from Jewish rabbis and scholars through today's contemporary teachers of the Old and the New Testament, Christian scholars as well. No other systematic account of the origin and the development of the Pentateuch has yet been formulated so lucidly or convincingly as to command the general adherence of the scholarly world. So basically what they're saying is, for lack of a better theory, non-conservative institutions continue to teach the Wellhausen theory. They don't have anything else, and so they continue to teach it, at least in its general outlines, as if nothing had happened in the Old Testament scholarship since the year 1880, which we now know is completely untrue. We do know that much has been discovered. In 1994, there was a stone, the Tel Dan, Tel Dan stele, a stela, it's just a stone, a rock that's been inscribed, was found, and until 1994, no extra biblical material had been written about David, and so it had become very popular in liberal circles to say that David was a construct, a fictionalized character of the Old Testament, that king in Israel who had really solidified the monarchy, solidified central government in Israel. And it was not until 1994 that that stone was found that actually records commerce between David and the Hittite Empire. But that's relatively recent in archaeological finds. So there's been no real breakthroughs, no real theories, nothing that they can come up with other than the more conservative view that God spoke to Moses, God spoke to these prophets, they were written much earlier, and they're unwilling to accept that, and so they continue to teach the Wellhausen theory. Now, here are some of the problems with the theory. It assumes that all Hebrews were ignorant, could not write. Many archaeological discoveries show that the people surrounding ancient Israel were skilled in writing. We know that Moses had a strong Egyptian education, having grown up in the courts of Pharaoh. Many wrote down their religious codes and laws, and we have that, including the Israelite codes and laws. And then the question we need to ask is, why does liberal scholarship believe that only Israel was unschooled and had no written language and no way of preserving its law and its religious systems? So here we see a very important question that has to be answered if we're to accept this more liberal view of the Old Testament. And then Deuteronomy follows a form that was discontinued after 1200 BC. Now, remember, we're counting down 1200 BC, 1100 BC, 1000 BC, 900 BC. 850 BC is when they say that the first documents were written here, but Deuteronomy actually contains a form of a type of treaty. It was a Hittite type of treaty known as suzerainty, and suzerainty treaty is proof positive that the Pentateuch could not have been composed after 1200 BC. This type of treaty ceased to be used, and we'll talk a little bit about what a suzerainty treaty is here in just a moment. There were three kinds of covenants or treaties in the ancient Near East, the ANE. There was a suzerainty or vassal treaty, which was an agreement between two unequal parties. One was of higher status, stronger, more resourced, the other of lower status, weaker, less resourced. Then there was a parity treaty, agreement between two parties of equal status or equal strength. And then there was a land grant treaty or covenant. And that was also an agreement between two unequal parties, one of higher status, one of lower. Both it and the suzerainty treaty were seen in the Old Testament. They were used. We see all three of these in the Old Testament, but between God and the children of Israel, we see these two, number 1 and number 3, being used. And we want to pay particular attention to the suzerainty treaty simply because it ceased to be used as a valid covenant, valid agreement form after 1200 BC. Now, what is that? What type of covenant or treaty is a suzerainty treaty? Well, number 1, it is a formalized agreement between two parties. It is witnessed by both humans and deities. So it was done in a temple, it was done in a sanctuary, it was done someplace where it carried religious implications, and it was done before a particular party's gods or goddesses. It was proclaimed by public readings, and then there was a deposit of the treaty. A copy of the treaty was deposited in a public place, typically some sort of a shrine of the witnessing deity. So it could have been the temple of Jehovah, it could have been the tabernacle of Jehovah, it could have been a high place, a totem grove for someone like Baal or Ashtaroth or someone of that nature in that time. So it was not only proclaimed or read publicly, but then it was written and it was placed in some sort of a sealed container at a holy place or shrine. And then it's sealed or it's codified. It becomes law by oath and ritual sacrifice. So this is not something that is just this carried a great deal of weight, and it was extremely important to the people that as they entered into this covenant style agreement, that the people knew that they as a community were entering into it. And basically, it was that to say that if I'm not faithful to this covenant, may what is done to these animals in ritual sacrifice be done to me. And we see this several times within the Old Testament pages, this type of treaty being formed. There's a stronger party. This would be Yahweh. And he approaches the Israelites, the children of Israel, and proclaims, I will be your God and you will be my people. I'll protect you. I'll provide for you. Now here's your part of the covenant. You have no other gods before me. You agree that there is no other God but me, and you will have no other gods before me. You'll keep a day holy unto me, the Sabbath, the seventh day. You keep it holy unto me. You don't lie and bear false witness. You don't commit adultery. You don't covet what your neighbor has. All of the what was summed up in the Ten Commandments, or what has come to be known as the 10 words, really, they were not long bits of law like what our laws are today, which try to specify every small possible thing down to every detail. These were very common sense laws for the children of Israel, for the Israelites to follow after. And if Jehovah was going to be their God, and their agreement, their part was to declare there were no other gods other than Jehovah or other than Yahweh, and that they would not have another God. They would not erect a shrine. They would not have an idol. So they've entered into this agreement with him. Now we see in the Old Testament that this agreement was made and then violated by the Israelites, and then once the violation was made, they were given the option to repent, to confess that they had violated it, ask for forgiveness. And in the Old Testament, there are times when they did this, and Yahweh forgave them for their violation of this covenant, and he reestablished the blessing. But when they refused to honor this agreement, when they continued to follow after other gods, then we see the anger. Here's one of those anthropomorphic terms: the anger, the wrath of Yahweh moves out against the people. His jealousy is inflamed, and so there is destruction. So there was plagues that entered into the camp of Israel at certain times. There were enemies who came in that he stepped aside and allowed to come in and to capture them and to destroy their homes and their villages, or even carry them away captive as slaves into some foreign land. And so these are the things, the worship of Baal at Peor, where the 24,000 young men entered into, and you'll see this later on in your study here in the Old Testament. We talk about the concept of a just war, where Moses, at the end of his time on earth, is commanded by Jehovah to destroy a certain portion of the Midianite tribes. And the reason for that was that the Midianites, using Balaam's advice, had set up shrines, prostitution shrines, that drew the young men of Israel out away from the Israelite encampment, and they entered into a different covenant. And we see in the narrative there in Numbers 24, Numbers 25, 26, 27, all the way up through Numbers 30 and 31. And that story that's told there, we see how Jehovah's anger swept in through Israel, and 24,000 young men died because they violated this suzerainty covenant that they had made, just recently made, with Yahweh. And they had entered into temple prostitution with Baal and with Ashtoreth, and it's called the sin of Baal Peor in the Old Testament, and that's what that's all about. And so because the Midianites basically had wholesale deceived the Israelites into doing this, and they used their women. Now, literally what happened, it was government sanctioned. The government forced it. The husbands, the fathers in the home said, wife, daughter, you go and you sit up in this, and you seduce these young men of Israel into this temple worship, or coming into worship Baal. They'll violate their covenant with Jehovah, and Jehovah will lash out against them. And that's exactly what happened. And so God punished the Israelites, but then God told Moses, you punish the Midianites who were involved with that as well. And that's exactly what happened in those passages. And we'll see that later on. That's another module for a later day. But this covenant is so important to them that it actually that it actually carried the weight of the entire tribe. In Joshua, the story of Achan and the sin of Achan, where he kept certain things that were supposed to be dedicated to God. He kept them, he stole them, and then God does not go before the children of Israel in a battle, and they lose, and 30 men die, or a certain number, I think it's around 30 men die at the Battle of Ai. And so we see that this covenant is so very, very impactful and important for the Israelites. And so this was in effect, this was being used in Israel in this day. This is why it's so important for us to know that this covenant ceased to be a form of covenantal agreement after 1200 BC. And so we know that this covenant wasn't used anymore after that time. You just can't find it. And so it seems to indicate that that the writings of the Old Testament were much earlier than these liberal scholars have believed. And lastly, we'll just give you kind of the parts of what a treaty would offer. There was a preamble that basically shared with everyone the purpose of the treaty, and it kind of gave all of the parties and the particulars of the treaty. It would talk about the people who were entering into this agreement, with whom they were entering into the agreement with, and it would kind of give some background to it. And then there was a historical prologue that kind of leads up to why the treaty it needed to be signed or needed to become a part. Then there were the stipulations. Typically, the stipulations for something like a suzerainty treaty is you cannot make alliances with other kings. It required a tax or a tribute, which would be tithes and offerings, as we see in the Old Testament. Sacrificial, grain offerings, animal offerings, things like that, to bring into the temple, bring into the tabernacle, that portable tent, that movable tent that they would use for their worship and meeting with Yahweh. And then there was provided for that vassal, for that weaker party, protection, security, blessing. They would make sure that there was food. The greater power would make sure there was food when the people needed the food, and make sure that there was a military protection when they needed military protection. And so Yahweh was basically saying to the children of Israel, I'll be your protection, I'll be your provision if you honor this treaty, this agreement, this covenant of law with me, and you have no other gods before me. You worship me and me alone. You honor my Sabbath day. And he, I don't want to go into all the commandments at this point, but every one of the commandments were the stipulations of this treaty. And when the children of Israel, as a body or as a large block of the children of Israel, would violate it, then the anger of God or the anger of Yahweh would break out against them. And then there were the provisions for the treaty, the deposit, and the public reading, where it was deposited in a certain place. We know that the law was deposited in the Ark of the Covenant. It was written on stone, etched in stone, and it was put inside of the Ark of the Covenant. And then there was the list of the divine witnesses to the treaty. In this instance, with the children of Israel, it was Yahweh. He was the only one that was a witness to the treaty. He was the only one that had made the agreement with the children of Israel. And then there were a list of the blessings and the cursings for fidelity or infidelity to the treaty or to the covenant. And we see that even as they enter into the promised land, there was the mount of blessing and then there was the mount of cursing, or the curses. And they placed on each mount these stones that showed that they had agreed with God, they had agreed with Jehovah, that they would follow his commands. And these are the blessings that they could expect. These are the curses they could expect if, in fact, they violated or if they kept their agreement with Jehovah. So, in this respect, to sum all of this up, to end our time together, in this respect, it's important for you and I to understand that liberal scholars have not taken into account all of the historical and archaeological data when they formulated and postulated the JEDP theory. And again, it is a theory. It is not fact. It is a theory. and they have no other competing valid views, and so they continue to teach it, even though it has been really, in the most part of it, summarily dismissed as being just fanciful. It was invented by some of these scholars back in the 1800s, and then Julius Wellhausen synthesized all of that into one view, which we now call the documentary hypothesis. Well, I hope this helps you to understand a little better about that and why it's such a controversial issue in those among those who study the Old Testament.